Good afternoon, everyone. Today we have Professor Gita Chadha. Professor Gita Chadha is a professor in sociology, University of Mumbai. She has been working on feminism and science for over 2 decades. She has designed many courses on feminist science studies and has organized several capacity building workshops for college and university teachers on gender studies. Professor Chadha writes profusely. Besides several newspaper and journal publications, she has also edited and authored many significant books. Few of them are Reimagining Sociology in India, Feminist Perspectives, edited with M.T. Joseph, published by Routledge in 2018. Feminist and Science, Critiques and Perspectives in India, 2-volume work edited with Sumi Krishna and published by Stree Publishers and Sage Publication. Gender and Patriarchy, published by Population First and Research Center of Women's Studies, SNDT University. This short introduction hardly does any justice to the range of work Professor Chadha has done in the area of science and feminism. Nevertheless, we are very happy to have you today and eagerly look forward to hear from you. Over to you, Professor Chadha.
Thanks, Bethesda. Thank you so much for inviting me for this talk. And I'd like to thank the Office of Communication at the Indian Institute of Science, and of course, Bethesda herself, for arranging this talk and inviting me for it. So I can see that we have a small audience. I hope that it is an interested audience. I'm going to try and speak a little bit today on the work that some of us have been doing in the last 20-25 years in India. But globally, it is something that has been going on. Probably I would trace it back to the 60s, in fact, 1960s, with the work of Thomas Kuhn. What I thought is, keeping in mind the kind of experiences that we've had in these last 25 years of building conversations across the disciplinary silos that our academia is organized in, the experience has been very complex, sometimes inspiring a sense of futility, sometimes inspiring a sense of optimism. But what I thought I could do today is something that is like popularizing. As I was telling Bethesda, I thought that it would be a good idea to keep it simple and to talk about the field as an attempt to popularize it amongst the intelligent audience, and not give a very specialist talk, because then what happens is the specialist talk always requires a lot of ground that we have to assume, which I'm learning is something we cannot. And I'm also learning that the ground needs to be built in a more systematic way, in a more structured way in our academic spaces. So today will be just an introduction to those who are present here to the field of science studies, and particularly feminist science studies. One can speak of the field in a larger way and call it a science technological studies or feminist science technological studies, but I largely restrict myself to science studies. So what is science studies? Science studies is an interdisciplinary field that sort of draws upon insights and analysis from the philosophy of science, from the history of science, from the anthropology of science, sociology, of course, and also maybe looking at it in terms of how literature looks at science. So it's a kind of an interdisciplinary domain which combines insights from various disciplines and how they look at this thing that has been named as science. Yeah. With the current, with the new education policy, You all know that interdisciplinarity has become a mandated, is mandated for higher education institutions. So in a way, I feel that maybe this is the moment for us, those who've been involved in various kinds of interdisciplinarities, to also ponder and reflect over what do we mean by interdisciplinarity and how do we sort of want to, you know, operationalize this for the future. And I submit to you that a rigorous interdisciplinarity requires us to actually be deeply grounded within our disciplines, and then find ways of moving out of those disciplines and looking at anything on hand. So if I want to do science studies and I want to bring insights into from philosophy, it's very important that I'm grounded deeply in philosophy for me to be able to talk about the philosophy of science and to be able to talk about the philosophy of science from the perspective of science studies. Yeah. So I would say that interdisciplinarity is not about just a patchwork job of taking a little bit from here and a little bit from there and a little bit from here and just putting it all together. Yeah, that kind of mishmash actually doesn't really help us in developing anything rigorously. So it's a difficult proposition as to how to operationalize interdisciplinarity. Do we need to start departments in science studies, or do we need to do science studies within our disciplinary locations? These are all open-ended questions. But the first thing about science studies is that we need to recognize that it is interdisciplinary. Yeah. The second, so that's the first methodological principle in science studies. The second is most naturally, following from interdisciplinarity, where we are looking at science as something within how it has been pondered over and thought about within these disciplines. Obviously takes us to the next point, which is that we look at science within a context. Yeah. So as a sociologist, for example, I will look at science deeply embedded in sociological questions, deeply embedded within society. I also will look at, therefore, how my discipline has looked at science. So my discipline, for example, of sociology has for the longest period of time, because we were modeled on the basis of the physical sciences, natural sciences. My discipline privileged science as an institution, as a knowledge-making practice, privileged it in the sense that it exempted it from sociological scrutiny. Let me explain this very simply. As a sociologist, you and I will try and look for social determinants of anything. Social causes, reasons, factors for anything. So we look for causes, social explanations for religious beliefs. We look for social explanations for philosophical perspectives. We look for social reasons for how political ideologies get shaped, how economic organizations get shaped. But strangely, we sort of didn't look at science as being socially determined, simply because the way science gets constructed in Western modernity, as a lot of you would know, is to think of it as something asocial, apolitical, ahistorical, value neutral, objective, over and above the social, transcending the social. So what happened in the discipline is science became exempted from social scrutiny. Till, of course, with the entire Manhattan Project, with the Vietnam War, sociologists begin to recognize that science is deeply implicated in the problems, quote unquote, that society is facing, the risk society, as we call it. Science plays a very important role. Because before that, we think of science only in terms of, and today that is also our dilemma, right? But before we start looking at the negative impacts of science, we think of science as something being more obviously the one tool for progress, you know, in the evolution of human societies and civilizations. And then comes a moment when we recognize that it is not as simple as that, that the tools produce, I mean, the tools that science gives us for social transformation and for progress can also produce, say, a dystopia, right? So that's when we start recognizing that it is not as innocent and pure an activity as we had presumed it to be. Yeah. So trying to look at science in a more embedded way, trying to look at science as being a part of society rather than being something outside of it, is a very important methodological shift that happens. And this also leads to us beginning to ask questions about the culture of science. Yeah, that if it is a part of society, then we start recognizing that society enters into it. Yeah, and it enters into it with all its complexity, including hierarchies, structures of power and organization that are there in the outer world, enter into the world of science also. So, for example, we start recognizing that why do Black people not get to do science? We begin to recognize the fact that science is a very male-dominated world. We begin to recognize the fact that people from lower castes don't get to do science very easily. So what is it? Very often the answer is that, oh, science is not responsible. The cultures in science and of science are not responsible for this. It's society which is responsible, which is that it's something outside which is responsible. Now, what we try to do is say that, and logically, that if science is a part of society, then we methodologically want to look at science and see what's happening there in order to explain this kind of a discrimination. Let's say this kind of a pattern where you see only few groups getting to do science. So this, for example, will be an important sociological way of looking at science, yeah, and making it the site for explanation, making it more accountable, rather than putting the entire onus either on the individual or on the society. I'll come to that when I'm talking about feminist science studies. So hold this point in your mind. The third important thing that we do look at is the question of, say, language. Yeah, scientific language. Again, like scientific knowledge, we think of language in science as being neutral. No, we think of it as being something which is only an instrument for communication. We don't think of language as actually reproducing, okay, a social biases in research. So we tend to look at language as something which is only a means of communication and nothing more than that in science. But in science studies, we would probably look at language more carefully, and we'd probably look at the role that language plays deeply in the construction of knowledge. Yeah. Now, I mean, I can go on and on about all this, but you know, we can take up some of these in the question answers. But so now what happens is that in science studies, therefore, very naturally, very organically, you will see the emergence of a critique, right? Because if we are questioning and challenging, okay, the way scientific culture operates, the way scientific knowledge is made, the way scientific language is deployed, yeah, naturally and very organically, we develop what is called science criticism, yeah. So just to say, I mean, of course, there's a huge difference between literary criticism and science criticism, but just for the purpose of, drawing a certain kind of an analogy or a parallel to make you sort of understand it more simply, that you have a novel and you're reading a novel, yeah. We assume that the author's intent is the only way to look at the novel, right? And there'll be treatises and treatises written on whether the author meant this or this, right? But what if we start looking at the novel and saying that, the author's intent is probably one intent, but the reader's intent is also an important intent. And also then we start looking at the novel within a context, within a historical context, within a social context. And once we start doing that, we develop a certain discourse around the novel, right? Which then becomes a domain, to put it very simplistically, of literary criticism. Yeah. We can then further critically examine and look at that novel and say, is there a bias there? Is there a gender bias? Is there a race bias? What is it showing us? Because a novel like Virginia Woolf's novels, for example, which were very, very important for feminists, yeah. But a Black feminist will look at that novel and say, oh, but this seems to be privileging a white woman's life, yeah. And it doesn't echo or resonate a Black woman's life, yeah. So now, in science criticism, to some extent, our effort is to look at science as a text, as a social text, and try to see whether we can find historical and sociological underpinnings and determinants in order to explain what happens in scientific culture, what happens in scientific knowledge, what happens in scientific language. Now, what has happened historically and very unfortunately is that this, before it even gets to develop the field of science criticism, see, literary criticism gets taught in literature departments. Where do we house, where do we find a home for science criticism in the academia? And that is part of the problem which we should all collectively talk about. Yeah. Anyway, what happens unfortunately in the academic battlefield, or let's say, if I want to be a little kind, say the playground, in the academic playground, what happens is efforts at science criticism are very quickly put into either a pro-science or an anti-science position. And this, in the last 25, 30 years, I think some of us have begun to recognize how this polemics actually, and we've all been part of it, right? You would have heard about the so-called hoax, and you would have heard about, the entire brouhaha around it, which was called the science wars, yeah? So this kind of science wars then sort of polemicizes the entire debate around science and shrinks the space for science criticism to develop. In the present political climate, it becomes even more problematic, yeah? Because today, if you're critical of science, you could easily start sounding very, very, how shall I say, very, very traditionalist, very, very, nativist, very, very, unreasonable. Yeah, it can become a part of a global politics, which is deeply connected with an identity politics. Yeah, so we have to guard what we do against the science wars on the one hand, and against the political scenario that we are in today, where we see a lot of unreason operating. Yeah. So we need to be very careful, because science criticism is not about that. Yeah. It is about, to a very large extent, about reclaiming or reforming the space of science, making it much more plural, much more diverse, in the interest of reason, in the interest of freedom. Yeah. So that is the terrain, in a very simple way, of science studies, which is a domain that has developed with the pressures from social movements like pacifist movement, the environmental movement, the women's movement, which has pointed out how science can actually you know, sort of reproduce and add to the kind of social problems that we live in today's world. So I now move on to a more specific form of science studies, which is what some of us have been trying to do, and which is what Batasta said there would be an interest in the group that is present here, which is to look at gender in science. Yeah. So I've been working to develop a field called the feminist science studies, which begins somewhere around maybe early 80s or maybe even late 70s globally, with works of Sandra Harding, Evelyn Fox Keller. Keller, in fact, traces the root of, or let's say context. She gives you a sense of the context in which feminist science studies develop. And she says that science had to be critically understood and challenged and questioned for feminist science studies to develop. But more importantly, within feminism, and we'll come to that if some of you might have questions about what is this thing called feminism and all that. But her argument is also that when feminist theory started maturing and evolving, and we started seeing that it's not just that you and I are constructed as gendered beings, that it's not just that our relationship between us is constructed as in a patriarchal way. But when we start also seeing that institutions, spaces of imagination and cognition, knowledge-producing spaces like science and art, also as spaces, as institutions, can be gendered, where there is a symbolic role or a hidden role of gender which is actively being played out. And it's only then when feminist theory has matured to that extent that a feminist science studies develops, because otherwise it's, you know, and also because feminist science studies is seen as a very esoteric field, you know, when there are such real problems that women are facing, like violence and, you know, gender discrimination at a workplace, and when all of that is happening, what is this business about trying to look at scientific knowledge as being gendered? Do we really need to spend time looking at that? Of course, that changes in the early part of this, in the millennium. Yeah. So feminist science studies probably looks at science with a gender lens. In India, I've also added saying that we became more confident and more, the urgency of developing feminist science studies happened when we also started questioning the development model that we had adopted. Yeah. So when we saw the negative impacts of that kind of development model, yeah, the big science, big industrialization, you know, when we started seeing that more critically, yeah, it's then that we started looking at. So for example, we start looking at development and what it does to the environment, the kind of models that we have of industrial development, and what it does to the environment, what it does to women's livelihoods, what it does to women's lives. Yeah. And then we start asking this question about is this really the kind of science that we want? Is this really the world that we want? Anyway, so you can see that something like a field like feminist science studies develops when science is already being critiqued, okay, by other movements and by disciplines and our own movement. Yeah. Then when feminist theories become more and more advanced and more complex, and when we also start asking the question of development. Yeah. So as I said, we use gender as a very important axis on which we examine science. Yeah. I don't need to probably tell you, but I guess we just quickly go over what gender means. Yeah. Some of us are still confused because very often gender means only women. Yeah? In most of our programs, you see gender sensitization means only about women. Okay? But gender as a concept that feminist theory actually and feminist movement actually introduced is a concept which is basically was in the classical period of feminist theory, was used to distinguish. So the concept of sex and gender were separated, because the conflation of the two was what we identify as was the basic problem. And let me explain that very simply. Sex was considered to be a biological phenomenon, and associated with that were emergent or associated with that were attributes and things that men and women, for example, could do. So if you are in a female body, then you become the homemaker, you become the child bearer and the child rearer and all of that. Yeah. And when you are in a male body, you become the the bread earner, one who goes out into the public domain, puts the food at the table, defends the community. Yeah. This kind of sexual division of labor is what feminists began to problematize. Yeah. And for that, we introduce the concept of gender to say that sex might be the biological category. Gender is the social construction of masculinity and femininity, right? Ideas associated with what a man should ideally be, what a woman should ideally be. Yeah. So these are socially constructed, and that these need not be conflated and must not be conflated. And so they are not fixed, either biologically or culturally, and therefore they can be changed, because the arrangement of this division of labor was highly skewed in terms of power between men and women. Yeah. So this is not a talk on feminism. So I'm just sort of laying the ground, saying that this is the idea of gender as we began. Today in contemporary feminism, so in this idea, there were men and there were women. Yeah. And there was a power equation between the two, which was very skewed and had to be set right. So a lot of early feminist movements and early feminist theories were trying to do that. In contemporary feminism today, we problematize this idea and we try to say that it's not that there are just two boxes. It could be either a third box, neither male nor female, or both male, both female, or what if we get rid of boxes and think of gender as a more fluid idea? Yeah, that it could move around the boxes. Further, we problematize this by saying in these boxes also, or in that fluidity also, it's not only gender that we need to understand. Because if you're talking about making science or society or anything a more just place, a more plural space, then we have to see along with gender how caste intersects, how race intersects, how class intersects. Yeah. When we do that, then we find nice ways of explaining certain things, which I will talk about in a bit. So remember that gender gets complicated, yeah, because now we have destabilized the idea of woman, singular woman. What we do is we ask what woman, from which caste, which class, what is her sexuality, yeah, in order to understand woman better. Further, as I said, we make gender into a more fluid concept. And the third important thing that we also try to do is not forget, but be attentive to the idea that the same gender ideology that constructs women also constructs men. Yeah? So how does masculinity actually play out? And how does masculinity actually need to be reformed? So for example, in science, in the culture of science, the question we can ask is the culture of science highly masculinized? If masculine attributes are about competitive, aggressive, uh, only governed by reason, yeah, these are historically attributes associated with the masculine. And we see a domination of that in science. And this domination is naturalized and normalized. So now how do we question that? Yeah. When we start questioning that, we question masculinity itself. So I don't know whether you're with me in this terrain, but let me come to more concrete things like what does feminist science studies do? Yeah. We start, of course, with the question of numbers, representation. Why are there so few women in science? In India, we know that the numbers actually are pretty good. Yeah. But then we see that these numbers have a very interesting pattern. You will see a lot more women in biology, you will see very few women in maths and physics. And that becomes a question to us, why? And then we start seeing how biology as a discipline itself is gender, because it's closer to nature, because women are supposed to be closer to nature. So there is a certain kind of implicit, symbolic, tacit understanding. When women are capable of doing biology, they're less capable of doing physics because it's more abstract, it's more mathematical, it's more formal. And of course, it's with governments. Yeah, so it's a very big power center. Yeah, so very few women there. What we try to do is understand these patterns and try to see them as things we need to explain without quickly resorting to the idea that no, scientific community with merit. If women are not there, it's because of their social roles and it's society which is responsible. Or maybe it's their biological abilities and they're not good at it. The brains are not made for it. So we are not responsible. Now, what we do in feminist science studies is try to say that both those explanatory paradigms might be to an extent correct. Maybe there is, of course, social roles. Maybe there are, of course, biological abilities, inabilities, capabilities, whatever. But what about that large space which we exempt from scrutiny, which is what is doing to ensure that very few women come? Or what can science do to open women? Now, we also further. It's not just a question of fewer numbers. It's also a question of, and that's where we work a lot in terms of generating narratives. Yeah. So the state and the scientific community for a very long time wants to or continues to want to generate what we call the role model literature. That there are no role models for women. That's why women don't do science. Let's make role. And this role model literature is very important. I'm not saying that. So for example, Leelavati's Daughters is an excellent compilation of women's stories about how they became successful. We need that, yeah. But our contention would also be that these stories where the woman is projected as, woman scientist is projected as the heroine, need to be made more real. They need to be fleshed out. And when you try to flesh out, you realize when you do interviews, for example, people like us, the kind of sociologist I am, we do a lot of qualitative work, we interview women, and we recognize there that as you scrape the surface, a lot of them will tell you about their experiences of gender discrimination, their experiences of how science is actually a very gated universe, okay? Their experiences about how even when they are in science, they're always made to feel that they're not good enough. They're getting their awards because they are women, okay? Because of affirmative action, that they are, you know, uh, constantly feminized, looked at as the female body, constantly an object of also exertion of power. So therefore, a body which is likely to be sexually harassed. Yeah. So when you start looking at these narratives, you recognize that it's not, the problem is not going to be solved by just getting more women in. It's important to get more women in, but the problem runs far, far more deeper. Yeah, the gender discrimination that women undergo, okay, is to be explained in terms of what happens in science. So when you talk about the pyramid, a lot of women in science to begin with, and then the very few reach the top. There's something going on within science also. For Boys Club, for example, a lot of women report this thing that, you know, if I go out for a drink, which is where, in the evenings, which is where a lot of things are decided about who's going to get awards, what's going to happen. So I was talking about the whole question of numbers, yeah, and narratives, yeah. So while we emphasize on generating narratives and not just numbers, and narratives are very often anecdotal, they are very often stories, and these have to be seen in a particular way rather than to be dismissed off as just subjective things. We require a lot of rigorous analysis, and that I won't go into just now, which I think we as sociologists, psychologists know how to deal with. But amongst the scientists, there is a certain dismissal and a disdain of the subjective and of the narrative. Anyway, so the first thing we try to do, therefore, is to go beyond numbers, go and look within deeply into the structures of numbers. Yeah. The second thing, of course, that we try to do is look at how scientific research, particularly in biology, you know, whether it is in neuroscience, or whether it is looking at, reproduction. Basically, the human body is seen as a gendered body. A lot of research actually reproduces certain kind of gender bias. Yeah, and so very often when we talk about discrimination, even in my classrooms, for example, a lot of young people and older people also will say, "But this is biology, no? Why are you trying to fight biology?" Yeah, as if biology is fixed, as if the brain is not plastic. Very, very, people like you would know more than I would that, you know, current research in whether it's in intelligence or whether it's just in the brain as an organ will indicate to us how plastic these things are. And when we fix them to the point that they become almost justifications of the kind of social hierarchies that we live in, something that we should challenge, no? So I would say that our scientific theories, for example, on sex and gender, is questioned by feminists. And we're hoping more and more feminist biologists themselves will question it. In India, we're seeing that happen very slowly. But we need people within biology who will say, why are we looking at women only in terms of reproductive bodies? Why are we looking at intersex people only in terms of a normal aberration What do we need to do to improve our biology? What do we need to do to improve our medicine? What do we need to improve, therefore, our health policies? Yeah, so it's connected, deeply connected. The third is a more complex, of course, a question which, as I said, is not something like we can do at the level of a talk, or whether we can do at the level of initial talk. But I'll just introduce you to the idea. That is that we look at what are the ontological assumptions that science makes, modern science makes about, for example, its subject matter, which is nature. Yeah, how, for example, is a lot of feminist work is done to see how nature is seen as something very passive. Nature is seen as something which is to be controlled. Yeah, nature is seen as something which is feminized. Yeah, so very often, and that was a big thing here, we use the pronoun she for nature very often without even thinking about it, because it's a certain world in which we live in, nature is naturally feminized. Yeah, and therefore nature is she and her and feminine and, you know, energy and all of that, but energy which needs to be harnessed, energy which needs to be controlled, energy which needs to be managed. Yeah, and who is going to do that? Science, culture, man of reason. These are deep implications. And nature obeys the laws. Yeah, so there's been a lot of effort to look at in feminist science study, and we'll do that here now, and to be able to ask questions about what we need to change the way we look at nature, the way we understand nature. Yeah, the environmental movement has, of course, put forward a lot of these questions, but the feminist would also tell you to pay attention to the kind of equation that we have, or the kind of language that we have, which is deeply gendered. Yeah, so if we start looking at nature differently, not in terms of her resources, but start looking at it, and many feminists have talked about it as its capability, and as looking at nature, us as part of this that we call nature. Yeah. The last thing that we look at is, of course, ask the question of method, in the epistemological question of the method of science, which presumes in what you're studying, how you're studying it, and presumes and enforces a certain distance. And keeping that analytical distance is almost the basic requirement of, say, the scientific method. Our argument would be that can we produce a more authentic knowledge if we talk about connectedness, that how we get connected. Now, it might seem very silly and stupid for you to, you know, think, am I connected to the atom that I, you know, and you can ridicule it, yeah, to the atom stream, or gene that I'm studying, or it's electromagnetic wave that I'm studying. Yeah. So idea is not to look at it as simplistically as that, but the idea is to be able to look at it saying that what I am doing here, the kind of apparatus that I'm using to study this, yeah, am I bringing in mechanisms?
The network is a little, you know,
which are shaping the picture that I'm going to see. It's a very complex question of epistemology in terms of the machinery that I have. My God, I hope I haven't confused everyone.
It was very good. So there's a lot of messages in the chat box. I think these are not questions.
Can I see? Let me see the chat box. I'm not able to see the chat box with us. I mean, I can, but I can't see the questions. Maybe because I logged out. I mean, I got logged out. You want to read the question?
Yeah, I'll read. I don't think these are questions, these are comments, I guess, but still I'll read it out. This is by Sahil Arora. Culture depends on nature, on feminist with science, or feminist with science refer to Earth Mother. Sociology can research intensively, extensively feminist gender-based theory. I think these are comments he has shared.
Okay.
One last question, I think he has. For IISc student research scholars, do you think in present mosaic scenario in confusive environment, nature parallel to culture over the time for achieving the best from feminist? I think this question is a little confusing. You can write to us, Sahil, and we can get.
Maybe if Sahil can unmute himself and ask, he might be able to explain himself better.
Yeah, Sahil can do that.
Sahil, would you like to do that? Sahil, if you're there, I think it might be better if you unmute yourself and talk. That might help.
We can't hear you. I think he is not able to. Are there any questions from anybody else?
Any thoughts, even if there are no questions, any responses? Are there people largely from IISc?
Yeah, no. Most of them are from IISc.
So maybe if we can, I mean, if there's time, we can just do a round of asking people for their responses if they'd like to.
Yes. Anybody would like to give a response?
I can see Apurva Mishra.